Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Well, hey, and thanks for listening in to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined by the Reverend Jack Shitama, author and ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. So, hello.
Thanks, Lauren. It's good to be with you.
Great. Well, thanks for being here today and taking some time out of your schedule to be with us. I usually introduce my guests kind of how I know them, and in this case, I really don't know you. I just have become a big fan of your podcast. Jack hosts the Non-Anxious Leaders podcast. We'll give a plug for it off the top. It's found you have it on iTunes and then on your website, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's on most platforms.
Yeah, but it's a really good really good podcast for breaking down some basics about systems theory or family systems theory, and we'll talk more about that. But before we dive too much into that, I wanted to ask you to introduce yourself. Share your story as much as you like, and then kind of talk more about that if you would.
Sure. I grew up in the D.C. area and did not grow up a Christian. Grew up in a secular household with professional parents. But in my late 20s, being married and having two kids, I started to realize there was something missing, and happened to have a series of people who shared their faith with me over the course of several years, and finally came to the point where I felt like I should check out this Jesus guy. And I remember praying a prayer, actually. It was, Jesus, if you are who they say you are, show me. And so that was, I guess, the fall of 1987. And
Wow.
from that point in time, I went to church, got involved in Bible study, it got involved in ministry outside the church, and by the July 1991, I was a pastor. So Jesus really did show me. Things happened so
Wow. Yeah.
quickly.
4
Yeah,
years.
4
They don't
years.
waste time.
Yeah, and in our denomination, you can start as what's called a student pastor. So I
Mm-hmm.
started seminary at the same time and graduated from seminary in 1995. And it was in seminary that I encountered Edwin Friedman's Generation to Generation, and that's where I was exposed to family systems theory, and it has really been a big part of my life ever since, both personally and as a leader in the church and in the nonprofit world. I pastored for 9 years, and then in 2000 was assigned to lead the camp and retreat ministry for our region of the United Methodist Church, which is the state of Delaware and the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I've been doing that for 20 years. So, but we are church related. And so I'm involved in Christian ministry and still connected to churches in that way.
Here's a question I didn't think to ask you even in our pre-conversation. How far up the coast of Maryland does it go to, your region?
It goes up to Cecil County. So we're on the Eastern Shore of Maryland is the whole eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay. And so it goes all the way up to northeastern Maryland, the northeastern corner of Maryland.
Interesting. Back in a former life, I like to joke about when I was an independent Baptist, I worked as a youth director for a Baptist church in Elkton, Maryland, which is Cecil County.
No kidding.
Just across.
What?
Just across the border from how they call it Newark, as opposed to those
Newark, where the University of
in
Delaware is.
Newark, Delaware,
Mm-hmm.
who pronounce it differently. But
so I live in Cecil County, Maryland. Elkton is our county seat. I
really,
live, 30 minutes. I live kind of the bottom part of the county, but I also pastored in Chesapeake City, which is the next town down from Elkton, and I pastored in Port Deposit, which is also in Cecil County, west of Elkton. So, wow, what a small world.
Yeah,
which church? Wild. Which Baptist church?
Newark Baptist Church. So it was a funny thing. I think it was started in Newark, Delaware, and then over the years they bought land crossed the border in Elkton, but kept the name. So
Wow.
it's
What a small world.
yeah, it's
That's
funny.
great. Yeah.
Well, I usually ask my guests if anything from your time and experience as a Christian in your past toward what it means to be as a Christian now, if anything has changed and anything you'd like to highlight or reflect on from that time.
Well, I think my own journey, I think, is maybe similar to a lot of people who come to faith after after childhood, maybe as a young adult or later. And that is, it starts out really focused on serving Jesus and making a difference in the world. And then as you get kind of sucked into the institution of the church, not, whether that's a denomination or even a single congregation,
Yeah.
you spend a lot of time focusing on how to change that institution. And so,
Yeah.
it's not that I don't want to make a difference in the world. I'm involved in we have an after school program for, young people at risk, try to be out in the world making a difference. But so much of what I think now is just how are we going to get the church to move? Now, I guess the
Yeah.
broader question, for what it means to be a Christian, I think is really up for grabs right now. I think just as our politics are polarized, I think the Christianity in the U.S. is polarized, and it's I think part of that, maybe even a central part of the culture war in terms of what does it mean to follow Jesus?
Yeah.
Is it about having the right identity,
Mm-hmm.
or is it about serving sacrificially in a way that represents what we believe God wants for the world? Theologically, we'd say the kingdom
Yeah.
of God or the reign of God. And so
Yeah.
I think right now we're in the midst of that struggle, and I'm hoping I know which way it goes. I think I know which way God wants it to go.
Mm.
So I think that's where I think things are headed, is that the identity of Christianity is moving from what used to be Christendom, where Christianity was the center of the culture, which probably
Yeah.
peaked in the 50s, early 60s,
Yep.
and Christianity is becoming marginalized. And I think that's a good thing. As I study
Mm.
church history,
Yeah.
whenever Christians have been outside of power, they've made the biggest difference for God. And so somehow, this decline of Christianity may be, the beginning of we who remain to really actually have a way to speak truth to power.
Well, we don't want to believe that, do we?
Yeah,
That
right.
being marginalized or pushed off to the side could actually be a good thing.
No, no, of course not. And we get angry at those who disagree with us, who we think are, part of the cause of it to happen. And I don't, care which side of the divide you're on. You think the other side is the cause, but
Yeah.
it's just, just like any family divided, it's just kind of the nature of the conflict.
Yeah, I don't know. This may or may not be related to what you're speaking of, but I've noticed as a church planter myself, I follow a lot of evangelical leaders. And I noticed, I'm curious if it's this way for you in the United Methodist Church, but I noticed, like, in the Disciples of Christ, in my context, there's what I would call like a remnant theology. Like, we're the only ones left, we're the only ones faithful, following God. And conversely, like so much of the evangelical world, there's this like, hey, we're prospering because we're the faithful ones, like because we're doing it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I've seen that too in our own denomination, where there's basically we're about to split over LGBTQ plus inclusion.
Right, right.
The a lot of the power churches are
Yeah.
more evangelical, and
Mm-hmm.
I think tend to have that viewpoint. And it remains to be seen. They are doing some things right. They're reaching people, but
Yeah.
but they're. I think some people want to be told what to believe, and other people want to be able to discern and interpret God in, in the way that they feel led. And so, my daughter was a youth pastor before she became ordained, and one of my proudest moments was when she left as a youth pastor, and one of the 16-year-olds got up and said, uh, what what I liked about Megan is she didn't tell us what to think; she taught us how to think.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so that's, if that's the faithful remnant, I don't want to say that either, because I don't want to try to
Yeah.
make any claims on who's faithful and who's not. But
Yeah.
I think that's kind of, that's where the conflict is right now.
Yeah. That's great. I'm curious about like spiritual practices that have become important to you, or maybe spiritual practices that you recognize as forming that you might recommend to others.
Well, being a United Methodist, which, in England, when John and Charles Wesley started their Holy Club, they were,
Yeah.
it was a pejorative to be called methodical or Methodist. And so they
Yeah.
really focused on spiritual discipline. So, Wesley's theology, which is, followed in the tradition of Christian, the central Christian tenets is that, these are means of grace. They're not grace themselves, but they're ways that grace becomes real to us. And so I find that they've been very important in my own life and as a leader trying to help others in their own faith formation. The two that are, I would say, most ingrained for me are prayer and meditation. I'm a big follower of habit formation, and
Mm-hmm.
actually have a book about habit formation. But being able to develop habits means they're automatic. You don't have to think about them. And so, first thing I do when I get up in the morning is intercessory prayer, and it is a bit methodical. I have a list of names I go through: family, friends, colleagues, sick, grieving. But I think what it does for me is help keep me grounded. That this is not about me. This is about how I am serving other people. And then the meditation, I always tried meditating, sitting still, and that never worked for me. I just fall asleep.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
I'm, I'm also a runner, and I heard Krista Tippett, I think, her has a show on NPR called On Being,
Yeah.
and she talked about how she actually was able to start meditating when she was doing yoga. The movement helped her, and
Ah.
so what I realized is, I started running without music. I used to listen to
Mm-hmm. Yep.
contemporary Christian music and thought that was a time of praise, but running without music, just running and letting kind of my mind meditate on
Yeah.
whatever the Holy Spirit puts in front of me. That's been an important part of my day. So I
That's
would,
great.
yeah.
That's great. I I actually ran for about 20 years. I had to stop because of a back injury, but I
Mm.
found the same thing, that running without music became a more spiritual experience for me than with music. Well,
Yes.
we could spend the whole time on this, I think, because I love your answers. But I want to move on to some of your work. You alluded to it. You have a couple books, like you said, one on habits, and the other one I want to talk about is Anxious Church, Anxious People, and it's in the field of systems theory, which we alluded to earlier. But tell me, if you can, what kind of prompted you to write this book?
Well, I guess when I first encountered family systems theory, and it became very important to me in my own leadership as a pastor, it was like, wow, this is great. And then when I became the director of a camp and retreat ministry, I started doing workshops for other clergy to share, how what we call leadership through self differentiation, this idea of using systems theory to help you become a better leader.
Yeah.
When I did these workshops, I was finding that people were having a hard time getting it. And when I talked to people who tried to read Edwin Friedman's book, Generation to Generation, they said, well, I just can't get through it because it is dense. And so I felt
Yeah.
like there needed to be something out there that helped people to understand it in more plain language, a more
Yeah.
accessible volume. So that's what I tried to do. I kind of think I'm simple, and so I try to make things simple for people.
Yeah, I know when I read that book, I take it a chapter at a time just so I could process what I read and not get overloaded. Well, take a minute, if you would, and just tell folks who are out there who aren't familiar with family systems theory or systems theory, just kind of what's the general idea of what it's about.
Well, the general idea of systems theory is that when there's upset or problems or things are going wrong, we don't try to identify one person and fix them or put it all on them, and that's typically what we tend to do. And what that does is that absolves us of our own input into the system, our own behavior, and how that might contribute to the situation at hand. And so, what systems theory teaches is we can only take responsibility for ourselves, but if we can do it in a healthy way, if we can express what we believe, express what we stand for, but also uh, do it in a non-anxious way and stay emotionally connected to everybody else in the system, then we actually provide opportunities for positive change. And what most systems tend to do is tend to push back against change, and that comes through anxiety and conflict and people trying to blame others and not take responsibility for self. And this happens in a family, this happens in congregations, this happens in organizations. And so I found that this was really helpful to me to understand the congregational system, my own family of origin, and even the ministry I lead now.
Yeah, that's great. I want to dive into some of your themes from your book, and they're kind of general themes.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. An effective leader is a non-anxious presence, and I know when I first read that, even just from reading some different family systems authors, I interpreted that to mean, oh, I can't be anxious. So tell us more about kind of what that means to the idea of systems theory, and then your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, which is even if you are a non-anxious presence, it doesn't mean you don't feel anxious inside. In fact, probably because you're trying to be a non-anxious presence, there's anxiety in you, but you're able to regulate it so your own anxiety doesn't make a difficult situation worse. So the non-anxious presence is really how other people experience the leader. One, as not allowing their own anxiety to feed into the situation, but then also being emotionally present. And the way I like to put it is an effective leader is able to say what she believes while giving others the freedom to disagree. So, when a leader is able to be in touch with who she is, claim what she believes and own it, but at the same time, not try to define others, not try to make others agree with her, then
Yeah.
that is experienced as a non-anxious presence. When we're around people like that, we want to be with people like that, even if we disagree with them, because they're not trying to change us. They're not trying to form us into their image. They're able to articulate what's important to them without putting any pressure on us to be the same. And I think that's the essence of being a non-anxious presence.
It really reminds me of what you said earlier about your daughter and the youth kid, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you would think when you're working with teenagers, well, you've got to inculcate values in them, and you've got to,
Yeah.
make sure they have the right faith. But we also know that kids that really have faith that sticks uh, don't inherit faith. They come to it on their own, and so that's the biggest challenge with kids growing up in the church is if they just inherit their parents' faith, it's not going to stand up when things really get challenging as an adult, and so recognizing that and helping them to become their own person really is important. That's true as a leader. Helping other people to become their own person is really important.
That's great. It's funny because I trained for youth ministry in Bible college, and so much of what we were taught was it was about an indoctrination. And it's
Yeah.
a rough way of saying it, but it's kind of the truth. That it was about forming these young minds into who you wanted them to be. And you said what you just said too previously is forming them into, I can't remember how you said it, forming them into what they should be or who they.
Yeah, they're developing their own faith,
Yeah.
and not inheriting it from somebody else. And
Yeah. Yeah. So related to this leadership and the non-anxious presence are these two terms, and you spoke to them, at least one of them recently in your podcast, self-differentiation which you've kind of alluded to here, and then sabotage. So speak, if you would, about self-differentiation and maybe just define kind of what you've spoken about previously to that.
Yeah, so self-differentiation, the way Edwin Friedman defines it, is the ability to define one's own goals and values in the midst of surrounding togetherness pressure. And
Mm-hmm.
in any system, whether it's a family, church, or organization, there is always pressure to conform. There are unwritten rules. There are these values that we all agree to abide by. And sometimes claiming our own beliefs, our own goals will come in conflict with that pressure to conform. Yeah. And so being self-differentiated is the ability to say that and claim that in a healthy way, not fighting with other people, not withdrawing from other people. That's why I say, an effective leader is able to say what she believes while giving others the freedom to disagree. That's the essence of self-differentiation. I know what I believe, and it's okay if we disagree, and I respect your even if you disagree with me. That is the essence of self-differentiation. And then sabotage is this concept that Friedman really developed. Murray Bowen, that's what the podcast was about. Murray Bowen is really the pioneer of this branch of family systems theory that Friedman built on. And what Friedman describes as sabotage is the system pushing back with surrounding togetherness pressure when there is change. Anytime there is change in a system, it makes people feel uncomfortable, and that change is then people unwittingly, they unknowingly. That's why some people don't like the word sabotage, because it's really not conscious. They unwittingly create this pressure to conform, to go back to the old normal. And what that does is that puts pressure on the leader, because the leader is, feeling, wow, I don't like this conflict. I don't like this pressure. And they have what Friedman calls is a failure of nerve. They give in. And so anytime you're trying to lead change in any system, you can expect that there is going to be this unwitting pushback, that people are going to be uncomfortable about it. And the least healthy emotionally, the least differentiated, are the ones who are going to create havoc in some way or another. And it's most often not by actually dealing with the subject matter. They find something else to pick on, because if they could do it in a healthy way, they would just say, I don't, Pastor, I don't agree with this. And when somebody talks like that, I think we ought to listen, because they're saying it in a healthy way. But when somebody starts, blaming you for the length of your sermons, or, they start talking about, how we shouldn't be doing fellowship hour this way, it actually really is a reaction to this other change we made in the ministry, and they're just doing it because they don't know how to express themselves in a healthy way.
Yeah. You know what? You did this on a podcast recently where you talked about sabotage being unwitting, and part of me kind of my insides kind of fight back and say, oh no, I'm sure people are doing it on purpose, but begrudgingly I've kind of accepted your point that it is probably the vast majority of the time unwitting. Change is just butting up against people's kind of preconceived notions or long-held ideas, and people aren't actively conspiring to sabotage. It's just they're trying to keep the status quo, so to speak.
Right. And if they knew it was happening, and could express themselves in healthy ways, they would probably do it. But what happens is there's just this anxiety that builds up, and they find the easiest thing to focus on to allow that anxiety to be unleashed. I give an example. This is more of a hypothetical example, but if I have a bad day at work with a coworker and I'm not able to express myself in a healthy way with the coworker, and I go home and I start picking on my wife, I start trying to pick a fight with my wife, then if she blows up, if she fights back, then I've gotten the fight I've wanted. I've found an outlet for that anxiety. and I've not
Yeah.
had to deal with my
Yeah.
coworker. And that's kind of how sabotage works. And I'm not, I maybe in retrospect, I might say, well, I really shouldn't have done that because it was really this other thing. But most of the time, we don't, we're not that, we don't reflect that much on our actions.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Um, you're alluding to another point, and this may or may not be accurate, but the idea of triangulation or
Mm-hmm.
triangles in systems theory is an example of you like lashing out at your wife in this imagined scenario. Is that an example of triangulating
Mm-hmm.
where the real issue is between you and this thing that happened at work, but you're bringing your wife into it to disperse your own anxiety?
Absolutely. A triangle occurs when you two people or issues, a person and an issue, are not comfortable. And so instead of dealing directly with each other, they find a third thing to focus on. So in this
Yeah.
case, I would be triangling my wife because I'm not comfortable in dealing with my coworker, and we do it all of the time. In fact, Murray Bowen
All the
said
time.
all the time. Yeah, Murray Bowen says it's the most stable form of a relationship because in general, most people aren't well differentiated enough to actually have
Mhm.
those kind of healthy conversations with each other. So we just go and triangle other people.
See, I didn't understand that when I first read it, but now it makes sense. Like it's not that triangles are the best form of relationship. It's just that because it's so hard to maintain a relationship with someone we're in tension with, we we go around forming triangles just to make things easier for
That's
us.
right. That's how we cope with life.
Yeah. Well, I want to keep talking about this in the context of church and the idea of anxiety spreading in the church. One author I've read talks about, uh, anxiety being one of the most contagious things that can spread in a church faster than even like an illness we're in now or pandemic we're in now. Like the anxiety is spreading faster than the virus, for instance.
Yeah, yeah, and the way it spreads is somebody, usually it's one of the least emotionally healthy persons, gets up in arms about something, and
Yeah,
like I said, it's typically not the thing that is the issue. It's not the thing that's causing the change, but sometimes it can be.
yeah,
What happens then is that those people in the middle who are maybe not well differentiated, but they're well meaning. What they do is they try to appease that person,
yeah,
or they try to fix the situation for that person, which automatically creates more anxiety and more pressure to conform to the old norms. And what it takes a handful of leaders, and especially the primary leader,
hmm,
that'd be the pastor or in a ministry, the director or whatever, to be able to maintain a non-anxious presence and to be able to not give in to the pressure to conform, but at the same time remain connected to those people who are resisting. And that's the hardest part, because what we want to do is when there's that kind of conflict, that kind of anxiety in the church, we want to surround ourselves with all the people that agree with us and kind of
yeah,
um, let's all band together and fight this thing. Well, all that does is polarize the church even more. And
yeah,
so if a leader can say to the most anxious people, I'm I really care about you, and I care about your feelings, but I, I can't agree with this. I can't agree with what you're saying. And
yeah,
if you give us a chance, we'll see. Maybe in the long run, this won't be the place for you. Now that's sometimes people can consider that
yeah,
provocative, but it's giving people a choice for their own destiny, which is
yeah.
really a part of that.
And that seems so bold. I don't know about you and your ministry training, but for me, it seemed like the idea was like to be nice to everybody, and you want to you want to mend relationships, fix those broken relationships, and so at least for me, the tendency is to try to like repair, just to rush over and repair that division.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is so much the opposite. It's just so paradoxical to at least how I've interpreted, what ministry is supposed to be about.
Yeah, and I think it's being nice is a big part of that. I mean, but it's also trying to make people, I don't want to say happy, but satisfied. Trying to reduce
Yeah.
conflict, and what that does is that creates a system where it's harder and harder to change things. In other words, the more people appease the
Yeah.
most anxious in the congregation, the harder it will be over time to actually lead any kind of significant change. And sometimes, I mean, I had an example of I had an experience where we actually sold a very beloved retreat center that we owned back in 2005, and had a big supporter of our ministry who was really upset about it. Really,
Yeah.
really upset. And every time I had contact with this person, it was awkward, extremely
Mm.
awkward. But I did my best to be a non-anxious presence, to stay
Yeah.
connected. I did not agree with them, but I wanted to let them know I still cared about them. And it took about 2 years of,
Hmm.
maybe contact 3, 4, 5 times a year. And that person actually came around and became fully
Mm.
supportive of the direction we were going in. And that's where the, family systems theory helped me the most, because it told me, in theory, if I am able to express myself in a healthy way, what I really
Hmm.
believe, but also stay connected to this person, they will eventually either come along or give up or whatever. And they actually became one of the biggest supporters.
That's what drives me crazy about systems theory is that I want it to like not work because it's harder.
Yeah, right.
And then I keep finding it working. I'm like, darn it. I guess I got to keep doing this.
Yeah,
I want it
yeah.
to be below me. Well, I wanted to ask you too, so we've kind of been touching on this idea of leadership in a church. You serve in the United Methodist Church that has kind of a different governance structure somewhat than my context, which is Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Um, Certainly, there's different in the evangelical world. There's different governance structures in different mainline contexts. There's different governance structures. What does systems theory leadership look like? Do you think? Is there a difference in these different governance structures of churches, or are the
Um,
basic principles kind of the same?
No, I think this idea of leading as a non-anxious presence, leading as a self-differentiated leader, can work in any system, because it's not about, for example, in our context, we have bishops, and a bishop could be authoritarian, and a bishop could tell everybody what to do, but I guarantee you that you're not going to have a healthy system, because nobody likes to be told what to do, and people are going to then start unleashing their anxiety in unhealthy ways. The healthy leader is all about the mission, and
Mm-hmm.
if the leader is able to stay focused on the mission, and, as I said, claim what she believes, this is where I think we should go, knowing that she may or may not be right, that this is just what I'm discerning, God, but then encouraging passionate debate, passionate discussion by other healthy people as what they believe the mission should be, or the
Mm-hmm.
direction should be. And in the end, then the leader does have to decide. But Patrick Lencioni, in his book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, he talks about this. If everybody feels like they've been heard, almost always, even if the decision is not their choice, they will support it, because
Yeah.
they're focused on, people aren't about their own agendas. They're not about their own, advancement, whatever. They're just focused on what is best for the mission of our church or the mission of our ministry. And if the leader can help people stay focused on that, and be able to, express her or his beliefs on that in a healthy way, then give other people the freedom to disagree and to passionately defend their position, that's all you can ask. And I think what that does is that promotes other people to be more healthy too. So it will
Mm.
help other people express what they believe, and also help other people to show respect for people who disagree with them, especially if
Yeah.
the focus is on the mission.
Yeah. It reminds me of I was talking to someone once who worked in like who had once had a job in like collections, and they found the most helpful training they received in working that hard job of trying to bill people for their collection, their long-standing debt, wasn't like offering them discounts on their debt, but just saying like, I hear you.
Mm. Yeah.
And when people like felt like their voice was heard, there's like, okay, how do I pay?
Yep. People want to be heard. I mean, look at what's
Fascinating.
going on right now in
Yeah.
our country with the peaceful protests
Hmm.
over racial injustice. People want to be heard.
Yeah. Yeah. As we're recording this, we're what, like 2 weeks in after the the killing of George Floyd,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
roughly. So it's a great point. I wanted to ask, in my context at least, there's a big emphasis now on kind of flat organizations, and what I interpret or what I understand is kind of a diminishment on like soul leaders. So this is kind of a two-part question. Like, A, does system theory promote hierarchies? And B, like, how does that balance with this kind of emphasis, at least as I see it, on like flat organizations?
Well, I think in most organizations, you do have to have a leader. It can be a flat organization or a hierarchical one, and how that leader handles herself or himself is really the key. And I think kind of goes back to my last answer, which is if that leader is really focused on the mission, is able to articulate her own vision, and then promotes people expressing how they think it should happen. In the end, the leader still has to make the decision. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether I don't necessarily think systems theory favors a hierarchy or a flat organization. I think in general, the smaller an organization it is, the easier it is to be flat. The larger
Yeah.
an organization, the harder, just
Yeah.
because you have so many people, and what's important in hierarchical organizations is well, I think it's as important in any organization. The leader has to be able to cast her or his vision. They
Mm-hmm.
have to be able to say, this is where I see God leading us. I may be wrong, but this is where I see God
Yeah.
leading us. People want to know what the leader thinks. They don't want the leader to be, a dictator,
Yeah.
but they also don't want to be leaderless. They don't want to be just out there on their own trying to find their own way. What the by casting a vision, the leader then provides context for other people to think of how God might be leading them within that or outside of it, and to challenge it. There are times when, as a leader, our vision may not be correct. We might be misreading something, and it's great to have people challenging you when you're in that situation.
Yeah. Well, you kind of live this out, and this is why I want to talk about this, because you've really been in the midst of these kind of difficult conversations and questions as a leader in the work of your summer camp. So, if you want to take it just a minute to talk about kind of your context there in the summer camp, and then how you've kind of had to flesh these things out in practice, like right now in the midst of this COVID pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we all know, a lot of things have changed, and things like summer camp just, you know, they have all of the things that we're not supposed to be doing right now, except being outside. The outside
Yeah.
part is good, but being close together, being in large groups, and that type of thing. And so, coming out of the spring, we knew that we weren't going to be able to run camp in June. We just in our state in Maryland, we've been reopening very gradually, and we
Yeah.
could tell that it just wasn't going to happen. So we canceled the first 3 weeks of camp, but we really thought we had a chance to open July 5th, and so we could run 5 weeks of camp. And we also knew we couldn't do it the way we always did, because then you have like 100 kids in a fellowship hall, singing songs and doing crazy
Yeah.
things, and that we knew that just wasn't going to happen.
Like what camp's about though, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's what makes the experience for kids.
Mhm. Yeah.
What the CDC and the American Camp Association did was they published guidelines on how you could do camp more safely. I don't want to say safe because I think
Yeah.
nobody knows, but
Yeah.
it was to have groups of 8 campers and 2 staff, a group of no more than 10, and they could go through the week without wearing a mask. They would eat separately. We would have takeout meals, no touch meals, and all that kind of stuff. But whenever we did large group stuff, each of those groups, those pods, so to speak, would be a safe distance from each of the other groups. So you might have 50 or 100 kids, but none of those 10 would ever interact with another. So we put in an exhaustive amount of work. Our staff was really great in trying to figure out how to make that work. And the reason we did it was we felt like, or the reason I did it, I mean, we did have some pushback from people on staff who thought it was kind of silly to do this exercise. We should just cancel. But I felt like this was an opportunity to serve kids and families who were really going to need it this summer. Kids have been inside, the families have been all together at home, and
trust me, yes,
yeah, tremendous amount of stress. And I thought, well, even if it's not camp as we know it, it's still an opportunity for kids and families to have something really special. So what I learned though is I learned a couple things. One was that it really was taking its toll on me, and I tried to get my board to decide for me. So we were having a board meeting every 2 weeks via Zoom, and I kind of put it to them to see if they could decide, and it was 5-5. 5 who said they wanted to run camp, and 5 who didn't. And
of course,
of course. And then they said, this is a really tough decision for you, Jack, but whatever you decide, we'll support you. But what I realized was, no, it's my job as a leader to just, to at least make the recommendation or say, this is what I think we should do. The board, they're great people. They're well-meaning. They do a good job, but they're not as close as I am. And by the same token, the staff, they all have their pieces of the puzzle, but I'm the one it's my job to try to figure it out. And so, it was a really challenging time for me, but I learned that I not to react to other people who were trying to pressure me one way or the other, but to try to maintain a non-anxious presence. I learned to, stay focused on the mission, and I learned to try to not make the decision based on, money, make it on mission, but also not put the ministry in the position of risking a financial disaster. And so we ultimately decided not to run camp. I think I shared in the podcast I did on it that one of the things I've found is I have now an orientation towards going without hearing God say go, but just based on what I know of Scripture and mission. We should be doing this. We should be out going and then looking for stop signs for God to tell me no, or tell us no. And that's what happened. We ended up with stop signs that made it really risky financially, that if we could do this and actually put the ministry in danger of closing, and really didn't want to do that. So.
Yeah, I recommend going back and listening to that podcast. It's a fairly recent one. And we'll take a break after this, but I find such a correlation between kind of that scenario you lived out and what many churches felt and really are starting to feel again, whether towards the idea of back 3 months ago, it was, do we cancel in-person services? And now it's, do we resume in-person services? And, correct me if I'm wrong here or I'm misunderstanding you, but I've kind of have that same philosophy as you've alluded to, at least as I understand you alluding to, saying, hey, you can hear the board and involve the board, but at some point, you have the most knowledge of the situation, most understanding as the leader, as the pastor, and it really needs to be your decision, or at least big recommendation.
Yes, yeah, and the church is a little bit different because they're volunteers and there's governing boards and things like that. So, in that case, the governing board could overrule the pastor, but it is the pastor's responsibility to make the recommendation, to say, this is what I believe, and here's why.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions.
Sounds good.
All right, we're back with Reverend Jack Shitama, author and ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and camp director, as we've been hearing. Some closing questions. You can take as seriously or as fun as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what's your big move?
Well, not having grown up in the Roman Catholic Church and not knowing a lot about it, but knowing enough from studying church history, I think I would allow the marriage of priests. I would allow the ordination of women, and I would allow the ordination of LGBTQ and the blessing of same-sex marriages.
Making some waves in your one day.
Yeah, right. But it's only for a day, right? So what can they do to me? I'll do all that and then I'm gone. So
Gone. You're gone.
yeah. And
sure.
You know what? I have the greatest respect for the Roman Catholic Church, and especially for this Pope. I think this Pope is really doing a lot to try to bring reform. But they also have 2 millennia of institution to try to fight, and that's a big challenge for anyone. So
yeah. Well, I feel like I should know this as since you're Methodist, but what's the theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life? Like, is it Wesley, or I should say one of the Wesleys, or is it someone else?
I was thinking about this because you did send me these questions in advance. I was thinking, well, maybe Wesley, maybe St. Francis, but actually, most recently, it's Martin Luther King, because I know that he was a complicated person.
Yeah.
And each one of us is, but I would really like to just spend some time with him and ask him how he took his own experience, his theology, and what he knew from Jesus, and then also Gandhi, and how all that enabled him to create a movement. Because in family systems theory, the country is a system. And he was a self-differentiated leader who created this tremendous movement. I mean, he wasn't the only one, but to me, it was his leadership through self-differentiation that tipped the balance. And I think we're looking for people like that right now.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of historical, Phyllis Tickle, who I imagine you're probably familiar with, there's an evangelical guy, Brady Shearer, who talks about kind of similar idea about this being like a 500-year type moment in history. So what do you think history will remember this current time and place for in the church?
Well, as far as the church goes, I think one thing is that it got shoved from the 19th century into the 21st century all at once because of the pandemic. Most of our United Methodist churches are very traditional, and
I want you to repeat that for our listeners. It got shoved from the 19th century to the 21st century, right?
Yes, yeah.
That's a great way of saying it.
Because a lot of our churches and mainline churches are still singing hymns from the 18th and 19th century. The contemporary hymn is "How Great Thou Art," so which is written in the 50s, I think. But if you think about it, most of them are doing virtual worship of some kind now. And if a pastor would have proposed that 4 months ago, they would have gotten laughed out. And but now here we are. I do coaching for clergy, and one of the clergy I coach is the pastor of a small church, 20 to 25 people on a Sunday. Most of them are 70 to 80 years old. And when this first started, she was writing an epistle to them every week. So, and it was being mailed to most of them. So it kind of had her sermon in there, and then prayer requests and news. So there was no virtual worship. But then about 3 or 4 weeks in, she decided to try Zoom. And they were so happy to see each other. There were like a dozen people the first week, and then 15, and then now she's got the whole congregation meeting virtually. So I think that's one of the things that will be remembered. I think the other is the battle in the mainline church over LGBT plus inclusion, and I think. I think it's only a matter of time. I think it's like slavery and the ordination of women, that it will look back and say, gosh, did it take so long? But we'll see. Could be wrong about that. So,
Kind of related to this question, what do you think Christianity will look like in 500 years?
wow. Well, I'm hoping we can get beamed to church so we don't have to drive or whatever. I think I don't know 500 years, but I think somewhere in the future, and maybe the not too distant future, church is going to have this combination of virtual and for lack of a better word, real. I don't think people are ever going to want to give up on gathering together.
Yeah.
I don't think we should. But what I'm hearing from many pastors is that there are people who are coming to their virtual services that never set foot in the church.
Yeah.
And it's because there's this deep spiritual hunger out there. But at least in the mainline church, we've figured out so many ways to make people feel like outsiders.
Oh man, we should do another podcast just on that.
Yes, exactly. Well, and the context you're in, the reason you're doing that is to try to wipe that out, right, and start from scratch. But there's so many of our churches that it's hard to wipe that out, and so the idea of the virtual is that it creates a safe way for people to dip their toe in. And so what I see happening, what I hope will happen, at least in the next decade to 2 decades, is that we're able to create virtual communities where people can connect in meaningful ways. And then we're able to give them ways to live out that faith by serving in the community, whether it's the homeless or, those who are hungry or, kids in need or whatever, fighting racism. And by doing that, the actual congregational part of it becomes the way people come together and celebrate. But I see people connecting to Jesus by first doing it virtually and then finding a way to, be the hands and feet in Jesus in the community. And then they connect with the body because they found that all of a sudden Jesus has given them a reason to live.
Wow. Well, this last 5 minutes have been just as good as the rest of the podcast. We're over time, or else I'd say we should keep going, but I want to respect your time. So where can people find out more about you?
The website, thenonanxiousleader.com. There's no punctuation in that, thenonanxiousleader.com. And I do a blog post every 2 weeks. I do a 2 for Tuesday email where I just recommend articles and podcasts and things. I'll make sure to put a plug for your podcast in there.
Thank you.
And I don't plug things that I get money for, but I just try to, curate things and help people out. Of course, the Non-Anxious Leader podcast. And there's also a network.thenonanxiousleader.com, which is a closed community and where we can just share about, how we're trying to live out being a non-anxious presence, and that's free. There's no charge for it, so you can connect with that as well.
Great. Well, again, to our listeners, I highly recommend the podcast just as an easy way to get introduced to Jack and his work. Each episode is about 15 minutes, right? And easily accessible, easily digestible, and just a great way to be introduced, maybe for the first time or again, to systems theory and some of the ways about leading. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.